Many cities in the United States have something in common. The oldest parts of the city, usually downtown, have gridded streets. Why are so many cities in the United States originally designed with a gridded street pattern? There are plenty of good reasons, but let's look at a few really critical ones. The first one is just human nature. Early US cities adopted the grid because it was the cool thing to do at the time. Cities weren't designed in a vacuum. City founders looked for their latest and greatest ideas for how to lay out a new city. At that time, it was the wide, straight streets of Versailles or the plan for London after the Great Fire in 1666. Perhaps the most influential plan, the one that captured the imagination of a new nation, was William Penn's plan for the city of Philadelphia. It wasn't the first colonial city to use a simple grid pattern, but as the colonial capital and largest city, it was influential in spreading the idea of a rational grid pattern. If the grid is good enough for the most powerful city in a newly founded America, it must be good enough for all cities, right? Of course, there are more practical reasons to design a city with a grid pattern. Grids are great if you expect your city to grow really fast. For example, in its earliest days, New York streets were laid out without any kind of discernible pattern and ended at Wall Street, named after the literal wall that separated the city from the wilds of Manhattan. In 1811, a group of civic leaders predicted that New York would continue to grow northward at a rapid pace. They drafted a street pattern that imposed a repetitive grid over the rest of the island. Critics of the plan doubted that New York would ever grow into such an audacious grid, but less than 100 years later, it was a city of over 3 million people. That kind of rapid growth may not have been possible without a clear, rational grid. New York was not the first to realize that using a simple, repeatable grid would facilitate fast, easy subdivision and growth. In fact, at this point, it was happening at a national scale. In the 1780s, President Thomas Jefferson signed two national land ordinances that imposed a simple 1 mile grid over much of the Midwest. A further act in 1862 continued that grid through the American West. Just like in New York, dividing the country into 1 mile grids and 6 mile townships allowed for orderly settlement of the continent. Selling grid squares also served as a great fundraiser for a fledgling nation short on cash. This nationwide grid brings us to the next reason city founders in the US used a grid pattern. With all of these new grid lines crisscrossing the country, it just made sense to use them when platting out a new city. A great example here is Chicago. As Chicago grew from the shores of Lake Michigan, it incorporated those square mile lines into its street network. Its major streets would be laid out at 1 mile intervals. This map from the mid 1860s shows, using dotted lines, that the future roads would follow those grid lines. You can see this today if you fly into Chicago. Chicago's neighborhoods conform to this grid pattern laid out during the Jefferson administration in the 1780s. The streets on the edge of Detroit are laid out in the same way. Not only did they accept the lines from the National Survey, they didn't even bother with clever names. You got 6 Mile Road, 7 Mile Road, and 8 Mile. Yep, that's where Eminem got the name of his movie. Now, as we move further west, the founding of new cities is tied to the construction of railroads. The railroad companies received vast land grants from the federal government to lay their tracks. To serve those trains, railroad barons established hundreds of new cities along the routes. Railroad companies, in the interest of growing these cities fast and making a lot of money, used gridded street patterns in the new cities. They often used the exact same plans for cities along the same route. To recap, US cities were founded with grid patterns because of influential examples of gridded cities, because grids make it easy for cities to grow fast, because cities use the same lines as those done by the national land ordinances, and because grids are really easy to plop down when building cities along a railroad. All of them, with the exception of the influential examples, really comes down to money. Gridded streets create lots that are rectangles or squares, making them easy to survey, subdivide, and sell. Of course, these days, cities are growing as fast as ever with street patterns full of loops and cul-de-sacs. But that's a video for another day.